All right, so this is the last part of 11.4. We're going to actually look at the events after fertilization to implantation. We're going to look at the role of the placenta, and then finally the hormones involved in pregnancy, and then finally in birth. So you'll see there's some positive feedback loops that actually result in the offspring being born. So the events after fertilization. Okay, so fertilization occurred. Now we know fertilization, that's going to happen here in the oviduct, okay? And then 24 hours afterwards, the cell begins the process of dividing. So you can see we've got cleavage, it's moving down. There's cilia to help kind of sweep the fertilized egg down into the uterus. And it's going to continue to divide 4 to 8, 8 to 16. And then finally, it's going to be a ball of about 16 in 2 to 3 days. Okay. And then at about a week, the cleavage is produced what's called the blastocyst. And this is what's going to implant. It's a sphere of balls. It's kind of like a basketball. So this is here. And the blastocyst is going to implant into the endometrium, and it's going to start secreting HCG. So HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, that actually acts like LH. Because you remember, if the egg isn't fertilized, all the progesterone made by the corpus luteum, which is back here, it's making a bunch of progesterone, and that is helping maintain this endometrial lining. Well, progesterone also acts as negative feedback on the luteinizing hormone that actually is what's keeping that corpus luteum around. And so when the progesterone starts, more and more, that means the LH goes down, and then that will cause the corpus luteum to disintegrate in negative feedback. And then finally, the progesterone will drop and shed the endometrial lining. But because this little blastocyst guy starts making HCG, it actually acts like LH, and it will keep that corpus luteum around even though there's no more LH. So that helps maintain the endometrial lining so the growing embryo isn't lost through menstruation. And then finally, implantation is going to take from day 7 to 14, and you'll see it's going to start growing into, here's going to be this will be the amniotic sac right around here with the amniotic fluid, and you can see the embryo starting to grow here. And these little finger-like projections will eventually become the placenta, which is going to be the barrier between the mom and the baby. All right, so here's the placenta. So after it's grown, those little finger-like projections, right, it's going to start to form this placenta. And here's kind of that outside, the amniotic sac, and here's the amniotic fluid, and the little growing baby here. And the placenta actually becomes an endocrine gland itself, and it's going to produce progesterone. So the corpus luteum actually does end up disintegrating, but because there is the placenta there to make the progesterone, the endometrial lining can be maintained. Okay. The next thing you need to know about the placenta is that its function is to exchange materials between the baby and the mom, right? So we've got the fetal blood and the maternal blood with a placental barrier. This is a selectively permeable barrier. You don't want just like open access between the two. And so you can see carbon dioxide and oxygen as they would in your lungs and other places, they just diffuse across that placental barrier. So the carbon dioxide in the fetus needs to diffuse into the maternal blood so the mom can expel that carbon dioxide, get rid of it. And then all the oxygen that she's taking in needs to be able to diffuse to get into the fetal blood for them to be able to take. Other things the baby needs, glucose, and that happens through facilitated diffusion. And they're also going to want antibodies from the mom. And antibodies, Y-shaped proteins are pretty big. And so that happens through endocytosis. And then water can be exchanged readily through osmosis in either direction. Urea can actually pass into the maternal blood to be taken away as well. So you should be able to talk about how things move across that placental barrier between the mom. And you remember us talking about the chorionic villus, that this is the area that has all these little fetal capillaries that are spaced around. So if you look at the placenta here, Here's the mother's maternal arteries bringing in fresh, oxygenated blood with plenty of glucose and other things into this placental kind of barrier area. And then the veins will take it away. And so growing out of, here's we got the umbilical cord, and it'll be attached eventually to the umbilical cord. You can see all these chorionic villus that are doing that exchange. So these are all baby capillaries that are just really thin and able to allow this exchange of materials. So then they can take it into into itself. All right, the outline, the role of hormones in pregnancy. I just wanted to kind of review this because it's kind of cool. You remember we have estrogen and progesterone being made by the corpus luteum, right? So you can see here it's being made by the corpus luteum up to this point. But see all this HCG? All this HCG is helping keep that corpus luteum around. So the estrogen and progesterone keep that endometrial lining. But after the placenta starts to grow, now you can see it's the placenta is going to start to allow the estrogen and progesterone to be made. So you can see that's coming from here. So both the estrogen and progesterone are being made there. There's still some HCG coming from the offspring, but that will kind of start to not be as much because it won't be as needed because you're going to have that placenta making the estrogen and progesterone. Now notice right here, right at the end, those hormone levels are going to drop at the end of pregnancy. And so when those hormone levels drop, you're going to start getting the contractions of this endometrial lining, right? So those contractions are going to start to expel and trigger birth. And then once that drop has come, oxytocin is stimulated. And what oxytocin is going to do, it does a couple things. One is it actually starts to loosen up the elastic, like make it more elastic, like loosens up the fibers in your hips and other places so they can widen out and allow the baby to come through. You can see here's the cervix, right? But the oxytocin also stimulates this whole uterus to contract, okay? And with that contraction, there's other hormones involved that are going to actually cause more oxytocin to be made. So each contraction triggers more oxytocin, which means more contractions. So this loop's a little bit more complicated than you need, but realize oxytocin stimulates contractions, and these contractions will stimulate more oxytocin. And that's why it keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger, because each contraction will stimulate more oxytocin, which will stimulate another and stronger contraction until finally the baby is born. And notice that's a tiny little cervix right there, and this baby has to get through. All right, so that's the end of 11.4, more or less. Hopefully it was helpful.